this is James Ellsmoor, the founder and CEO of Solar Head of States, and one of the Forbes most influential young entrepreneur. So he's a social entrepreneur with expertise in sustainable innovation and entrepreneurship in rural, remote, and island regions. So he has experience living, working, and traveling in over 40 countries and had worked in government and private and non-profit sectors. His hard work has turned up lives of people. So he's the top 20 young entrepreneurs and Forbes 30 under 30 also. So congratulations to you and most welcome to James to Greenomics World interview today. So hi James, thank you for coming.
Good to be here.
Yeah, so James, I'll have some questions for you from for today. So, James, your organization, Solar Head of State, has installed solar voltaic systems on iconic buildings, right? So, I can personally attest that it was fun and inspiring. So, what kind of impact do you think it made in the society and within business community?
Sure. So the whole principle behind Solar Head of State was that we, through small scale installations on prominent buildings, we can really change the public mentality. I mean, that's one of the biggest things right now. And actually, I've seen papers that have shown in the US that the biggest indicator of whether someone installs solar on their rooftop, this is in the US, is not income, is not political ideology, it's whether their next door neighbor does it first. And I think that says a lot about human mentality. You know, the early adopters are often, you know, quite trailblazers that lead the way for other people. And so by encouraging governments to install solar on public buildings, on town halls, on the White House or equivalent in any country, parliament buildings, we can make a really big impact. And what we do is, you know, we work with the governments. We have different donors that can supply the panels or the inverters, so we can do it at a slightly reduced rate. We're a non-profit charity, so we don't make any money off the projects. But we work with the governments to do a media campaign and kind of community engagement projects. So the media campaign is really to make sure that we can leverage the impact of these installations to get as much information out there as possible, and to make sure, you know, all the local TV stations are talking about this and use this to explore why solar is important. And then, for example, in our project in Jamaica that we're doing right now, we run a youth competition. So we encourage young people in the country to enter a competition and create songs and projects about renewable energy to try and get the information out there. So we're really trying to do a hearts and minds type project where we can engage with the general public and use low cost projects to get as much information out there as possible.
James, if you see like continents like Africa, Southeast Asia, they are going for a complete, you know, energy transition in terms of the transition which is happening with a lot of technologies coming up, a lot of companies coming up, a lot of investors willing to invest on those sectors. So basically, so being you are so involved with all these projects, so what political and cultural circumstances, as your opinion, are needed for smart growth of renewables in rural areas and isolated communities and islands? So based on your experience, what are those you know, cultural circumstances and government initiatives you are thinking as a challenge? And
so you said the political barriers?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Sorry, I didn't catch the middle of it. Yeah. So I guess the interesting thing there is that most of the countries we're working in are the small island developing states. It's a group of countries known as SIDS. They're in kind of three different areas. You have the Caribbean countries, the Pacific Island countries, and then the kind of a group of countries around off the East African coast and the Indian Ocean, also Cape Verde on the west coast and Sao Tome. But so three kind of groups of countries. The interesting thing about working in those countries is it's a bit different to some of the sub-Saharan African countries in that the electrification rate is generally very high. So the issue is not that people don't have access to electricity. Most homes have electricity in most of those countries, with a few exceptions. The difficulty is the cost. The cost of electricity in most SIDS countries is anything from 3 to 6 times higher than you would pay in the United States and Europe. While obviously the income is much lower, so you have a huge barrier to development. Why would you locate any industry in a country that has 6 times the price of electricity that you have in Western Europe? So that is a huge barrier to the development of some of the SIDS countries. What's also interesting is that these SIDS countries tend to be some of the worst affected by climate change. If you look at the impacts such as sea level rise and the hurricanes we saw last year in the Caribbean, they really adversely affect SIDS countries. So there's a big incentive to move towards renewable energy from a carbon reduction point of view, although the countries aren't necessarily going to have much of an impact if they become carbon neutral. It's more about the statement that they're making. It's also using renewable energy from a resilience point of view. So I think one thing that we often have to work on is that people often associate renewable energy with just carbon emission reductions, and that's one part of renewable energy. But there's also a lot of other reasons to use renewable energy, and improving the resilience of a grid is definitely one of those. But also these islands, because you have this high rate of electricity, you're doing some really interesting projects where they're kind of ahead of the game. You know, you can test out a lot of ideas using batteries and things that wouldn't be economically viable in larger countries. So I think you're going to see a lot of interesting experiments from the utilities and the governments of these small island developing states, where they are testing the new utility models, testing how renewable energy can be best integrated and optimized, and how batteries can be incorporated into a grid system, and those systems can be then applied. In terms of barriers, some of the big barriers are really the politics, and this is the same in SIDS countries and in all countries, are the ingrained interests. So in many respects, renewable energy is already price competitive in a lot of countries. Obviously, it varies depending on the country and depending on the technology. But the issue is that ingrained interests and the status quo tends to win out, and particularly with a difficult system like a utility. You know, utilities do have a difficult job, and they need to be very careful on their bottom line, and so they often don't like change. And so I think the issue now will be finding an innovative utility model that can both allow distributed generation and the incorporation of renewables, while also still allowing the utility to function as a business. Did that answer your question?
Yes. This another question, like, can you elaborate on challenges you face while implementing projects in island nations? Do you encounter any resistance from the communities, because those are very different, socioeconomic circumstances which you must be facing? So, is there any resistance while implementing the projects in the areas where you are currently working on?
Yeah, sure. So I think the one that we're working towards is the knowledge and education barrier. And again, this applies in all countries, but people are used to the existing technology, and often it's not widely known how advanced the renewable energy movement is. You know, I think people like us who are in the sector and we're talking about it every day, we take for granted the use of renewable energy, but actually a lot of people just aren't aware of how modern and ready to use it is. So the public education, and not just public education, often educating politicians, educating the key stakeholders that are making decisions, is really important here, to make sure that it's well known that these people, or that this technology rather, is ready to go. I think that the financing is a key one. It's even if your payback period in say a SIDS country is only 3 or 4 years, it still can be quite difficult to have that upfront cost, particularly for small businesses and individual householders. How do you have that upfront cost and are there effective financing mechanisms? And for small countries, that's very difficult, and in other countries as well. So I think financing is always going to be the key. I'm not an expert in the mechanics of that, but it's always an issue that comes up. How do we finance these projects and create a way for people to use them? Because if we have the financing, then the economics makes sense. It's just getting that in place and really allowing people to embrace renewables. And then finally, it's, as I mentioned before, utilities and across the board, utilities are often reluctant to allow distributed generation, because of course every time someone sticks solar on their roof, that's less income for them. And particularly in a small country where you have a limited number of customers, they don't like seeing their customers going to generating their own electricity. Now that's fine right now. They can try and block people from doing that. The danger is in the future that as batteries become cheaper and cheaper, that a growing number of customers might take themselves off grid completely, which will completely, I mean, the battery price as it's dropping will completely revolutionize how we look at renewables. But it's also going to cause some challenges as we work out how we shift our economy to a system where people can generate and store electricity on site.
That's wonderful. On the perspective of the investment, like funding all these projects is like the key, right? So, do you think how scalable is it for an investor to focus on returns on all these projects without government, backup or a government subsidy? So, do you think we can think of a business model where it will be investors delight or investors paradise without, like, if you see in countries like US or Europe or India or Southeast Asia, it has its own taxon now. So solar has reached to a point where it doesn't need any government assistance. So do you think, is there any innovative model which you can think of, or we can do or invent, so that it will also go for the islandic nations and as well as this rural and African market?
Well, that's the $1 million question. If I had the answer to that, then I might not be here. I'd be no. I think, and again, talking about the small island developing states, the problem is scale. Being able to do any projects on scale, just because you haven't got enough people to often be able to do huge projects, and entering any new market is expensive. When it's a tiny market, it increases all your costs a lot. So, well, I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did, but I think there are huge opportunities out there when you have these big electricity prices, but high electricity prices, I should say. But I think that the big barriers, I would say, are probably political, that are stopping things moving. And so the issue becomes that when people do have these innovative new projects, they might not be able to get much headway with politics and with the utilities. So we need to create an environment that's conducive to allow people to be innovative, to allow people to suggest these new things. And no, I'll keep thinking about that one, because we do need new ideas like this. Sorry, that wasn't a very good answer.
Because what I understood is, like, as of now, it's mostly a CSR activity from a big company or a government incentive which is funding all these projects for implementation. So we need to have really a model where the investor will by themselves will be willing to fund all these projects, right? So that is one major challenge, I think.
So you mean scalable for our business specifically? Got it. Well, in that case, we're a bit different. I mean, we're not really, I don't do Solar Head of State full time. I have my own consulting business where I do other projects as well. Solar Head of State is a non-profit organization. We're only a small organization, and we aren't really designed to be scalable. As you know, it's kind of an interesting model that we're really just aiming for these big buildings and working with governments. So we do have some upcoming agreements. We actually already have an agreement with the Pacific Island Development Forum, where we're discussing working with all 12 of their member states. So we're working in different countries, but this isn't an organization really that's designed to scale hugely and make millions and millions of dollars. It's more about this education side of things. I only do that, some of my time, and then in my spare time, I have my own business where I do work engaging with renewable energy countries that either want to enter some markets in the Caribbean or working for or on the marketing and the PR side. So it varies according to the day of the week for me.
James, being one of the most aspiring entrepreneurs, doing a lot of work on the green and renewable energy field. So what advice you will give to these budding young energy entrepreneurs going ahead?
Sorry, what is the?
So the question is, what advice you will give to all these budding energy entrepreneurs who are out there in the market and trying to do something and bring a change?
Well, I think in India there's a really interesting situation now with the International Solar Alliance, which has really been pushed by the government. And I've been following them closely because that's going to really, I think, change the model of how we, specifically the solar industry, but how that industry moves. I mean, unfortunately, America is not really, there's not much happening there with renewables now. The current administration, there are some states like California and New York and maybe Massachusetts that are still pushing ahead. But I don't think, maybe for small businesses within America, there's opportunities, but I think for the big international businesses, the real opportunities are in South Asia, are in Africa, are in Latin America. There's huge opportunities there, and particularly as we see electrification projects around the world, opportunities to bring electricity to people. There's going to be a lot of new business models developing around batteries. Batteries are going to be the real big change over the next 10 years. So I think it depends a lot on the country and a lot on the industry. But for solar, I think follow what the International Solar Alliance are doing and the countries that they're engaging with, because that's really going to be the future of the industry. And I think for Indian businesses, there's definitely an advantage there because your government is being so proactive through the ISA to promote Indian business. So that will definitely be interesting going abroad. But of course, in the Indian context, you have enough of a market within the country that you might not even need to go abroad in that sense. But and for the rest of the world as well, I think Africa is just so exciting. I saw you have a webinar next week, or I guess whatever. I don't know when it will be in relation to this interview, but that's such an exciting market, and there's so much money now in the growing middle class in Africa that I think that that will also be really interesting. So I think one issue that we have in Europe and America is still a bit of a closed-mindedness, not realizing that the opportunities actually aren't in our countries anymore. The opportunities are abroad, but and renewables, I think the good thing about renewables as well is that you really need to be able to communicate between different sectors. To be successful in the renewable industry, I think you can't just work in the private sector. You need to engage governments. You need to engage NGOs, particularly in some of the southern countries that I mentioned. And you need to be able to work across different sectors, which makes it a bit different to other industries. If you're selling merchandise or something where you don't really need to. I think renewables, you really need to know how to engage in these partnerships and work with these different sectors. So I think it's really exciting. Lots of opportunities and lots of things to come over the next few years.
Yes. James, I'll go ask you one last question on this interview. So the question is, do you think technology is going to play the key role in promoting renewable energy to this rural and undeveloped and isolated communities?
I think the microgrid technology is going to be amazing. I posted some articles about this the other day because I think most people don't understand microgrids well enough, and I think that for isolated communities, we've gone beyond the point of grid extension. There's no point in extending huge national grids. I mean, if you had a new country today that just rose up out of the sea and you were to build a grid, you would not build the national grid like we have in most countries, you know, and that often gets blackouts and is not very resilient to natural disasters. You would completely look at the grid in a different way. And so again, I think that some of these regions in East Africa, like Kenya, for example, where building rural microgrids are really going to be pioneering models for how countries that already have big existing grid infrastructure might adapt their own grids in the future. Because if we have a national system of microgrids that all link into each other, particularly in countries that are prone to hurricanes and earthquakes and things like that, we can make ourselves so much more ready for the effects of climate change and really use renewable energy not only as a way to reduce carbon emissions and reduce the impacts of climate change, but also respond and adapt to climate change. So batteries, as I said before, I think that's going to be, batteries with microgrids are really going to change things, and I'm excited to see how that is operated. I think we need a shift in mentality as well, and that's the big thing. Not just the people in the industry, because I think people in the industry are starting to understand this, but the general public, to say that, you know, we don't depend on a centralized grid anymore, that we are becoming more localized and more resilient. And, you know, if you could, I think the exciting projects that I've seen are community-owned and run projects where you have a group of people in a small community working together to make a grid and to operate that grid. And I think those projects have been very successful in some cases, particularly in some rural areas. There's a project in an island in Scotland called EIGG, E-I-G-G, and that has been one of the pioneering. They built their project in 1997, an off-grid system, and that has really been a pioneering system that has then been replicated throughout the world. And I think it's exciting to see these early adopters, small community of 100 people that really change the way we think about electricity. And I think we're going to have plenty more like that in the next few years.
So, thank you, James. This is really wonderful. And yes, you know, storage has seen a huge transition in this market now. In India, as well as world around, in India, there is a lot of policies coming up for manufacturing, and as well as, you know, government initiatives for huge storage-based transition for decentralized sector. So there's a lot of things happening in terms of technology, and I think that is one area where the day when we are going to store energy, that is going to solve a lot of problems. So that is really good. Thank you, James, for coming to Greenomics World interview, and we will be promoting this interview along with your perspective to our audience for their knowledge and for any information or for any help regarding developing microgrids or developing any innovative models in rural in Southeast Asia or in India as well as in Africa. So we will directly connect them with you, all the players. So that will be really great. Thank you again, James, and congratulations for being one of Forbes magazine's 30 under 30 entrepreneurs in energy. That is really wonderful achievement to have at such a young age. So thank you very much. Thank you.